Below is the adapted transcript for your voiceover, with the narration kept exactly the same in tone, style, and wording, except for replacing your channel name with Reddit Exposed Hub. The narration maintains the raw, emotional, and intense delivery of your original post, suitable for a dramatic and engaging voiceover. I've ensured the content remains identical, capturing the urgency, anger, and reflective moments as you describe them, with only the channel name changed where applicable. If you want me to adjust anything further or confirm specific stylistic choices, e.g., pacing, emphasis, let me know. Voiceover transcript for Reddit Exposed Hub. Look, I need to get this out because I'm sitting in this plane right now and I can barely think straight. 3 hours ago, I was having a normal Tuesday at work when my phone started blowing up. My sister Charlene was calling me over and over. And when I finally picked up, she was practically screaming into the phone that Mom and Dad sold my car. My car, the 2019 Toyota Camry that I bought with my own money, that's registered in my name, that I've been making payments on for 2 years. They sold it for $15,000 while I was at work 3 states away. But here's the thing that really gets me. This wasn't some desperate financial emergency. Dad has been planning this for months. Charlene told me everything through her tears because she was so freaked out by how calm and calculated he was about it. Apparently, he's been telling people around town that I owe them money for raising me. That 18 years of feeding and housing me means I'm basically in debt to them forever. He had paperwork ready, knew exactly who to sell it to, had the whole thing planned down to the minute. The buyer was this guy, Walker, who lives 2 streets over. Dad had been talking to him for weeks about getting a good deal on a reliable car. Walker thought it was legitimate because why wouldn't he? My own father was selling it, had the keys, knew everything about the maintenance history. Dad even had some fake story ready about how I was moving overseas and needed to sell quickly. When I finally got Dad on the phone, he wasn't apologetic or panicked like you'd expect someone to be when they just committed what's basically theft. He was methodical. He told me I needed to wire them the $15,000 immediately as payment for all the years they supported me. Not asked, told me, like this was a business transaction he'd been planning all along. Mom got on the phone after that, and the things she said, I can't even repeat most of it, but the core message was clear. I was a financial burden for 18 years, and now it was time to pay up. She said they'd changed the locks on the house. My room was already being rented to someone else. And if I didn't send the money within 24 hours, they were going to start selling my other belongings that were still stored there. The worst part is how organized they were about it. This wasn't some impulsive decision or a family crisis. Dad has been building this narrative for months that I somehow owe them for my childhood. He's been telling relatives, neighbors, anyone who'd listen that I was selfish for moving away for work, that I abandoned them after they invested so much in raising me. My sister was crying because she realized they'd been setting this up as some kind of lesson. Dad kept saying I needed to learn responsibility, that I'd been too comfortable thinking I could just live my life without paying back what I owed them. Mom was nodding along like this made perfect sense, like selling your adult child's car without permission was some kind of reasonable parenting strategy. But here's what they don't know. I've been expecting something like this for 2 years. Not exactly this, but something. Ever since I got the promotion and moved to Chicago, there have been comments about how I think I'm better than them now. How I've forgotten where I came from. Dad especially has been weird about my success, making little digs about how easy my life is compared to his. So, I've been preparing. I documented every payment I've made on that car, every insurance payment, every oil change. I have records of every conversation where they acknowledged it was my car. Every time they borrowed it and asked permission first. I've been keeping detailed records because I could feel this building. While Mom was still ranting about how I was a parasite who'd been bleeding them dry for years, I was already looking up flights. I didn't argue with them or try to reason with them because there's no point. You don't reason with people who steal your car and then demand you pay them for the privilege. You take action. The flight I'm on right now gets in at 11 p.m. I've already called Walker and explained the situation. Turns out he's actually a decent guy who had no idea what was really happening. When I told him the car was registered in my name and I never agreed to sell it, he immediately offered to help sort it out. He's keeping the car at his place until tomorrow when we can meet with the police. I've also been making other calls during this flight. Calls to lawyers, calls to the bank about the car loan, calls to people my parents definitely won't expect to hear from. Because while they were busy planning their little scheme to teach me a lesson about respect and financial responsibility, I was building something they can't just take away. They want to treat me like a tenant who owes back rent? Fine, I'll show them what it's like when someone actually treats you like a business transaction instead of family. They changed the locks and rented out my room? Perfect. That makes this so much easier. I spent 18 years thinking these people actually loved me. That family meant something to them beyond what they could extract from it. 2 hours into this flight, I'm realizing that discovering the truth about who your parents really are might be the most valuable thing they've ever given me. The plane's about to land, and I can see the city lights below. Dad always said I needed to learn about consequences. Tomorrow morning, he's going to get the education of his lifetime. Update, just landed. Walker texted me that my parents showed up at his house an hour ago, demanding to know why the car was still in his driveway. Apparently, they were planning to tell me it was already gone and completely sold. This is going to be even more interesting than I thought. Update 1. Holy hell, you guys, I thought I was prepared for this conversation, but I was so wrong. I'm back at my hotel right now, and I need to get this all out because my hands are literally shaking from anger. So, I got to Walker's house this morning around 8. Really decent guy. Turns out he's a mechanic, and he immediately knew something was off about the whole transaction. He said Dad seemed way too eager to close the deal quickly and kept pushing him to pay cash instead of going through normal channels. Walker had been planning to run the VIN check today anyway, which would have shown it was still registered to me. We drove over to my parents' house together because I wanted a witness, and frankly, I needed the moral support. I rang the doorbell and Mom answered, looking completely shocked that I was there. She actually asked me how I got there so fast, like she thought I was still in Chicago and this was all going to happen over the phone. When Dad came to the door, that's when I realized how deep this thing really goes. He wasn't surprised at all. He looked at me standing there with Walker and he just nodded, like this was exactly what he'd been expecting. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me he was glad I'd come because now we could settle this properly face to face like adults. I asked him how he could possibly justify selling my car, and his response was so calculated it scared me. He said I'd been living rent-free in his house for 18 years, eating his food, using his utilities, wearing clothes he paid for. He had it all itemized in his head, not written down anywhere, but he rattled off numbers like he'd been calculating this for months. $200 a month for rent, $50 for food, $25 for utilities, miscellaneous expenses. He claimed I owed them approximately $45,000 in back payments for my childhood. Mom was standing behind him, nodding along, while he explained that the $15,000 from the car was just the beginning. They expected me to either move back home and start paying monthly rent going forward or pay them a lump sum to settle what I owed from before. She kept repeating that they sacrificed everything for me, that Dad worked double shifts when I was little, that they never took vacations because everything went to raising me. But here's the part that really got to me. When I pointed out that parents are legally obligated to provide for their children and that you can't retroactively charge someone for their childhood, Dad got this weird smile. He said legal obligation and moral obligation were two different things. He said the law might not require children to pay back their parents, but decent people understand that family means taking care of each other. The conversation went on for almost 2 hours. I kept trying to explain that what they did was theft, that they had no right to sell property that belonged to me, and they kept circling back to this idea that I was being selfish and ungrateful. Mom started crying at one point and said she couldn't understand how she raised a son who cared more about money than family. That's when it clicked for me. This isn't really about money at all. This is about control. Dad has been watching me build my life in Chicago, and he can't stand that I don't need them anymore. He's been telling people around town that I think I'm too good for them now, that success has made me arrogant. But what he's really upset about is that I'm not dependent on them anymore. Walker was trying to stay out of it, but when Dad insisted the sale was legitimate, Walker finally spoke up. He said he'd been uncomfortable with how quickly Dad wanted to finalize everything and that he'd never encountered a seller who refused to let him speak to the car owner directly. Dad's whole demeanor changed when he realized Walker wasn't going to just go along with this. Mom jumped in and started accusing Walker of trying to cause problems in their family. She said this was between us and he should stay out of it. But Walker held his ground and said he wasn't comfortable keeping a car that might have been sold without the owner's consent. He offered to reverse the sale completely and return Dad's money. That's when Dad lost it. He started yelling about how everyone was ganging up on him, how he'd worked his whole life to provide for his family, and now people were treating him like a criminal. He said I'd poisoned Walker against him, that I was manipulating the situation to make him look bad. Mom was crying harder and saying she just wanted her family back together. But then Dad said something that made everything fall into place. He said that maybe if I'd been calling home more often, if I'd been visiting more, if I'd been sending money to help with their bills, none of this would have been necessary. He said he'd been hoping I'd learned some responsibility living on my own, but instead, I'd gotten selfish. They've been struggling financially. Not desperately, but more than they wanted to admit. Dad's hours got cut back at the plant 6 months ago, and Mom's been picking up extra shifts at the diner to make ends meet. They've been watching me post about my job and my apartment on social media while they're clipping coupons and worrying about bills. I asked them why they didn't just talk to me about money problems. And Mom said they shouldn't have to ask. She said family is supposed to look out for each other without being asked. Dad said real men take care of their parents when they get older, that this is how things work in families that actually care about each other. The whole thing is so twisted. They convinced themselves that taking my car was some kind of life lesson about family responsibility. They genuinely believe they're in the right here. Dad kept saying I needed to learn that actions have consequences, that you can't just abandon your family and expect no repercussions. Walker ended up leaving with my car keys and said he'd park it at his shop until we could get everything sorted out legally. He told my parents he respected their right to have family disagreements, but he wasn't going to be part of what looked like theft, regardless of the family dynamics involved. After Walker left, Mom begged me to stay for dinner so we could work this out properly. She said they'd made pot roast, which used to be my favorite when I was a kid. Dad said if I really cared about family, I'd sit down with them and figure out a fair way to handle the money situation. They both seemed to genuinely believe that a good meal and some conversation could fix this. But I'm done. I'm so completely done with their manipulation and their twisted logic about what family obligations mean. I told them I'd be back tomorrow with paperwork to officially reclaim my car and that if they interfered with that process, I'd be involving the police. Dad said that was exactly the kind of threat he'd expect from someone who'd forgotten what family means. Mom said she never thought she'd see the day when her own son would threaten to call the cops on his parents. I'm sitting in this hotel room right now, and I keep replaying the whole conversation. Part of me wonders if I'm being too harsh, if there's some way to salvage this relationship. But then I remember how calculated Dad was about the whole thing. How they both seem to think they're entitled to control my life and my money just because they're my parents. Tomorrow, I'm going to the police station to file a report and then to a lawyer to make sure I understand all my options. I've also been doing some research on my own, and I found out some things about their financial situation that they definitely don't know I know. This is far from over. Edit. Thank you all for the support in the comments on Reddit Exposed Hub. A lot of you are asking about the research I mentioned. I'll explain more in my next update. Right now, I need to focus on getting my car back legally, but there are definitely some other things my parents aren't being honest about. Update 2. You guys, I don't even know where to start with what happened today. So, this morning I went to the police station first thing. The officer I spoke with was actually really understanding about the whole situation. Apparently, they see family disputes over property more often than you'd think, especially when adult children move away and parents start feeling entitled to their assets. He took a full report and said that since the car is registered in my name and I never gave permission for the sale, it's pretty clearly theft, regardless of family relationships. Walker met me there and handed over all the paperwork from the transaction. The officer looked through everything and confirmed that Dad had forged my signature on the title transfer. Not just signed my name, but actually tried to copy my signature style. Walker said he'd wondered why the signature looked hesitant when Dad was signing it, but he'd assumed Dad was just nervous about the sale. Getting the car back was actually the easy part. The hard part was what I discovered when I started digging into their finances while I was waiting at the police station. Remember how I mentioned doing research? Well, I'd been suspicious about their money problems since Dad's whole speech about struggling to pay bills. So, I did some checking. I still have access to the family insurance policy because I'm listed as a beneficiary. When I logged into the account to update my contact information, I could see the payment history. Turns out they've been 3 months behind on payments for almost a year. But here's the interesting part. They weren't behind because of Dad's reduced hours. They were behind because they'd been taking cash advances on their credit cards to cover other debts. That led me to check public records for their property taxes. You can look that stuff up online for free if you know where to search. They're 2 years behind on property taxes. The county has already filed a lien against the house. And if they don't pay up by January, they're looking at foreclosure proceedings starting next spring. But wait, it gets worse. I called my sister Charlene while I was driving back to town with my car. She's been living at home since she graduated high school last year and working at the grocery store while taking community college classes. She had no idea about any of the financial stuff, but she did know that Mom and Dad had been arguing about money constantly for months. Charlene told me something that made my blood boil. Apparently, Dad has been telling everyone in town that I'm making 6 figures in Chicago and refused to help my family. He's been painting himself as this proud father whose successful son has abandoned him. He told the guys at the plant that I'm too good for my hometown now, that I've gotten greedy and selfish since I started making real money. The truth is, I do make decent money, but it's not the fortune Dad's been describing. And more importantly, they never once asked me for help. Not directly. They've made plenty of guilt trip comments about how hard things are, but they never sat me down and said they needed financial assistance. Instead, they decided to just take my car and demand payment for raising me. When I got back to town, I drove straight to their house. I was done playing games. I walked in without knocking because, technically, I still live there legally until they changed the locks. And I found Mom and Dad sitting at the kitchen table with a bunch of paperwork spread out. They looked up when I walked in, and Dad immediately started yelling about how I was trespassing, how I couldn't just walk into their house anymore. But I cut him off and told him I knew about the tax lien. The look on his face was priceless. Mom went completely white. That's when the real conversation started. I asked them point blank why they didn't just ask me for help with their money problems instead of stealing my car. Dad got defensive and said they shouldn't have to ask, that I should have been offering to help all along. Mom started crying and said they were embarrassed about how bad things had gotten. But then Dad said something that made me realize how calculated this whole thing really was. He said they'd been planning this car thing for weeks because they figured if they could get me to send them the $15,000, it would prove I actually cared about family. It was some kind of twisted test to see if I'd choose money or them. I asked him what would have happened if I just wired them the money like they demanded. He said they would have used part of it to catch up on the property taxes and the rest would have gone to paying down their credit card debt. Then they would have sat me down and explained that they needed me to start sending money home regularly to help with ongoing expenses. Mom jumped in and said they'd calculated that I could afford to send them at least $500 a month based on what they figured I was making. She said that was reasonable for an adult child to contribute to his parents' household, especially since Dad had worked so hard to give me opportunities when I was growing up. The whole thing was a setup. They never intended to just take the $15,000 and be done with it. They wanted to use my reaction as proof that I cared about family and then leverage that into ongoing monthly payments. Dad actually said he'd been hoping this would bring us closer together, that he missed feeling needed by his son. That's when I lost it. I told them that manipulation and theft weren't parenting strategies. They were criminal behaviors. I said if they'd been honest about their financial problems, we could have worked something out, but instead, they'd chosen to steal from me and try to guilt me into paying them for raising me. Dad stood up and got in my face. He said I was being dramatic, that families help each other, and I was acting like they'd committed some major crime instead of just asking for support. He said the car thing was their way of getting my attention because I'd been ignoring their hints about needing help. Mom kept saying they'd given me everything when I was growing up, that Dad had worked overtime for years to pay for my clothes and school supplies and sports equipment. She said she couldn't understand how I could be so cold about paying them back now that I was successful. I asked them how much they thought would be fair for me to pay them back for my childhood. Dad said they weren't asking for full repayment, just ongoing support that recognized everything they'd sacrificed. Mom said she thought $300 to $500 a month was reasonable until they got back on their feet. But here's the thing that really got to me. When I asked them how long they thought it would take to get back on their feet, they couldn't give me a straight answer. Dad said it depended on a lot of factors. Mom said they were getting older, and it was natural for adult children to help support their aging parents. They weren't looking for temporary help with a specific financial crisis. They wanted me to become a permanent source of income to subsidize their lifestyle. The car thing was just the opening move to establish that I owed them money and would pay when pressured. I told them I was willing to help with the property tax situation because losing the house would be genuinely catastrophic, but that any help would come with conditions. I wanted full transparency about their finances, a realistic plan for getting back on track, and an end to the manipulation and guilt trips. Dad said he wasn't going to let his son dictate terms to him about his own finances. Mom said they didn't want charity, they wanted respect and acknowledgement of what they'd done for me. They both seemed genuinely offended that I would want oversight of how my money was used. The conversation went on for almost 3 hours. By the end, it was clear that we fundamentally disagreed about what family obligations look like. They think being parents gives them the right to demand financial support from their adult children. I think being parents means you accept that raising your kids is your responsibility, not an investment you get to cash in on later. I left without making any commitments about helping with their money problems. I told them I needed time to think about how to handle this whole situation. Dad said I was being selfish and ungrateful. Mom said she never thought her son would abandon his family over money. But here's what they don't know yet. While I was there, I took pictures of all the paperwork they had spread out on the table. Bank statements, credit card bills, tax documents, all of it. I also recorded parts of our conversation on my phone, including the parts where they admitted the car thing was a planned test and where Dad described their expectations for ongoing monthly payments. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with all this information yet, but I'm definitely not going to let them manipulate me into becoming their personal ATM. And after today's conversation, I'm starting to think there might be more to their financial problems than they're admitting. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with a lawyer to discuss my options for protecting myself from future manipulation and potentially helping them in a way that doesn't reward their behavior. I've also got some ideas about how to address their ongoing money problems that they're definitely not going to like. This is far from over, but at least now I understand what I'm really dealing with. Holy crap! The comments on Reddit Exposed Hub are insane. A lot of you are asking about the recorded conversation. Yes, it's legal in my state to record conversations you're part of without telling the other people. And yes, I'm keeping everything documented. This is going to get much more complicated before it gets better. Final update. Alright guys, this is it. The conclusion to this absolute nightmare of a family situation. I'm emotionally drained, but I wanted to give you the full resolution on Reddit Exposed Hub because you've all been so supportive through this whole mess. So, yesterday, I met with a lawyer to go over everything I documented. She reviewed the recorded conversations, the photos of their financial documents, all of it. Her advice was pretty straightforward. I had solid evidence that they'd committed theft by selling my car without permission. But pursuing criminal charges against my own parents would be emotionally devastating and probably wouldn't result in significant consequences anyway since they'd returned the property. But she also gave me some information that changed how I was thinking about this whole situation. She said that based on what I described about their financial problems, they were probably looking at bankruptcy within the next year, regardless of whether I helped them or not. The property tax lien, the credit card debt, Dad's reduced hours. It was all adding up to a financial collapse that was bigger than anything I could realistically fix with monthly payments. That got me thinking about what I actually wanted out of this situation. Did I want to punish them for trying to manipulate me? Did I want to help them despite their behavior? Did I just want to walk away and let them deal with the consequences of their choices? After thinking about it all night, I realized what I really wanted was for them to understand that their approach was completely unacceptable and for us to find a way forward that didn't involve manipulation or guilt trips. So, I decided to give them one final chance to handle this like adults. I drove over to their house this morning and asked them to sit down for a serious conversation. I told them I'd spoken with a lawyer and that I could pursue criminal charges for the car theft if I wanted to, but that I was more interested in finding a solution that worked for everyone. Dad immediately got defensive and said I was threatening them, that I was using lawyers to intimidate my own parents. Mom started crying and said she couldn't believe I'd involve strangers in our family problems, but I cut them off and said this was their chance to listen if they actually wanted my help with their financial situation. I laid out my proposal. I would pay off their property tax debt directly to the county, which would remove the lien and save their house. I would also help them set up a realistic budget and possibly assist with some of their credit card debt. But in exchange, they had to agree to several conditions. First, they had to acknowledge that selling my car was theft and apologize for it without trying to justify their actions. Second, they had to stop telling people around town that I was selfish or ungrateful for not sending them money. Third, any financial help from me would be structured through a third party so they couldn't pressure me for additional money later. And finally, they had to agree to family counseling to work on communication and boundaries. The conversation that followed was probably the most honest we've ever had as a family. Dad initially refused all my conditions and said he wasn't going to be treated like a child who needed supervision with his finances. Mom said the counseling requirement was insulting, that we should be able to work out our problems as a family without involving outsiders. But when I started packing up to leave, Mom grabbed my arm and begged me to stay. She said she was terrified of losing the house, that they'd put their whole lives into that property and didn't know how to start over somewhere else. Dad sat down heavily and admitted that he'd been feeling helpless about their money problems for months and didn't know how to ask for help without feeling like he was failing as a provider. That's when the real conversation started. Dad told me that watching me succeed had made him feel like he was somehow falling behind in life. He said he'd worked at the same job for 25 years and had nothing to show for it except debt and stress. When his hours got cut, he felt like he was letting down everyone who depended on him. Mom said she'd been embarrassed about their financial problems and didn't want me to think they were bad with money. She said they'd been hoping to figure things out on their own without burdening me. But as the situation got worse, they started feeling resentful that I was doing well while they were struggling. The car thing, according to Dad, was supposed to be a wake-up call for me about family responsibility. He genuinely thought that if I cared about them, I'd immediately send the money, and then they could explain what they really needed. He didn't see it as theft because, in his mind, family money should be available to help family members in crisis. I asked them why they hadn't just been honest about their problems from the beginning. Mom said they were ashamed and didn't want to look like failures to their successful son. Dad said he'd been raised to believe that asking for help was a sign of weakness, and he'd been trying to find a way to get support without actually having to ask for it. We talked for hours about their financial situation, their expectations for family relationships, and my own feelings about being manipulated and guilt-tripped. By the end of the conversation, I think we all understood each other's perspectives better, even if we didn't agree on everything. They eventually agreed to my conditions, though not without a lot of discussion about what each requirement actually meant. Dad was particularly resistant to the counseling idea until I pointed out that if we couldn't learn to communicate better, we'd probably end up in this same situation again within a few years. So, here's where things stand now. I'm paying off their property taxes directly to the county this week, which will save their house from foreclosure. I'm also setting up a structured payment plan with their credit card companies through a debt management service, which will help them get their monthly payments under control. They've agreed to stop talking about our financial arrangements with other people. And Dad has promised to correct the narrative he's been spreading around town about me being selfish. We're starting family counseling next month with a therapist who specializes in adult-family relationships. Most importantly, we've established clear boundaries about financial discussions. If they need help in the future, they have to ask directly and be completely honest about their situation. No more manipulation. No more guilt trips. No more taking my property and demanding payment for it. I'm not sure if this is going to work long-term. Part of me is still angry about the whole car situation and the way they tried to manipulate me. But I realized that holding on to that anger wasn't helping anyone and that sometimes you have to choose between being right and being in a relationship with your family. The other thing I've learned from this whole experience is that financial problems can make people act in ways that are completely out of character. My parents aren't bad people, but desperation and shame turned them into manipulative versions of themselves. That doesn't excuse what they did, but it helps me understand why they thought it was acceptable. I'm driving back to Chicago tomorrow, and for the first time in weeks, I feel like this situation is actually resolved. Not perfectly and not without ongoing work, but resolved in a way that preserves our relationship while establishing clear boundaries about acceptable behavior. Thanks to everyone who offered advice and support on Reddit Exposed Hub during this mess. Your comments really helped me think through my options and figure out what I actually wanted to achieve. Special shout out to the people who suggested involving a lawyer. Having professional guidance made all the difference in approaching this strategically instead of just emotionally. And for anyone dealing with similar family financial drama, my advice is to set clear boundaries early and stick to them. Help if you want to help, but don't let guilt and manipulation drive your decisions. Family relationships should be based on love and respect, not financial obligation and emotional blackmail. Final edit. A lot of people on Reddit Exposed Hub are asking if I think they'll actually stick to the agreement or if they'll try to manipulate me again in the future. Honestly, I don't know, but I've learned that I can't control their behavior, only my response to it. If they violate the boundaries we've established, I'll have to make decisions about the relationship based on their actions. For now, I'm cautiously optimistic, but definitely keeping my guard up.